Hello, everyone. Are we on? Everyone hear me okay? Welcome to the New York Public Library. Please silence your cell phones. My name is Salvatore Scibona, Weinberg Director of the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers here at the library. As some of you know, the Cullman Center selects 15 fellows a year for a 9-month term. Fellows receive an office in the center, access to our collections, and a stipend so they can focus exclusively on their work during their fellowships. The fellows are some of the very best and most promising academics, independent scholars, poets, playwrights, journalists, dramatists, artists, and fiction writers at work today. They come here from around the country and the world to use the unparalleled collections housed at this library to write the books of tomorrow. The Cullman Center was founded in 1999. We're currently hosting our 26th annual class of fellows. This series of conversations presents the books they came here to write. Just this once, however, we are presenting a book by a writer who was not a fellow. Gene Strouse was merely the director of the Cullman Center for the majority of its existence. During most of that time, she was at work on a project she codenamed Wertheimers, long before that, the movie phenomenon from 2 summers ago. The resulting book, Family Romance, is an entrancing and dramatic account of John Singer Sargent, Asher and Flora Wertheimer and their many children, and the arresting portraits he made of them. The book takes place in an era, as Strouse writes, of flux, for the art market, for Jews in Britain and beyond, for global finance and political power, and for visual art. It's also a surprising account of a great and driven master artist who managed to be a considerate human being, and of patrons who appear sincerely to have loved him. The initial reviews of Strous's book have been wonderful, including one in the Wall Street Journal that calls it, quote, a book as finely crafted as the portraits it describes. That is some high praise. In this case, it's really true. Family Romance is crammed not only with painstaking research, but of character sketches in only a few bold strokes that make the many figures in the book walk right out of the page, as Anna and Betty Wertheimer seem about to do on the cover. Here, for example, is Strouse on one of Sargent's subjects, Sir Philip Sassoon. Quote, baronet, politician, aviator, sybarite, collector and patron of art, Philip was such an elusive character that one acquaintance compared him to a fragrance. Tonight, Gene Strouse will talk with novelist Hernan Diaz. After about 35 to 40 minutes, they'll move on to your questions. If you'd like to pose a question, please write it on the index card on your seat. Staff members will walk along the outside aisles to collect your questions in about 30 minutes, so keep an eye out for them. This event is being live streamed on YouTube. If you're joining us virtually, please share your questions either in the chat or by emailing cullmancenter@nypl.org. Copies of Family Romance are for sale in the hall, and Jean has generously agreed to sign your copy for you after the presentation. She is joined by our friend Hernan Diaz. Hernan is the Pulitzer Prize-winning and New York Times bestselling author of Trust, which the New York Times named one of the 100 best books of the century, and which he wrote upstairs. Maybe not entirely. His previous novel, In the Distance, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and the PEN/Faulkner Award. He's received the John Updike Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and a Whiting Award. His work has been translated into 37 languages. Diaz worked on Trust during his 2020-2021 fellowship at the Cullman Center. Gene Strouse is the author of Morgan, American Financier, and Alice James, a biography, which won the Bancroft Prize in American History and Diplomacy. Her essays and reviews have appeared in the New York Times, Architectural Digest, Newsweek, and other publications. Strouse has been president of the Society of American Historians, a consultant oral historian to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and a fellow of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. She served as the Sue Ann and John Weinberg Director of the Dorothy and Louis B. Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library from 2003 to 2017. It gives me great pleasure and it's an enormous honor to welcome Jean Strouse and Hernan Diaz.
Hi, Jean.
Hi, Hernan.
Thank you, Salvatore. I want to jump right into the conversation, but I would like to echo that review and Salvatore's words and say that if there's one portraitist in this book that rivals Sargent, that would be you. And there's so many painterly similes one could use to talk about your book, your brushstrokes, your chiaroscuros, your use of perspective, your use of distance and texture, but none of them would be enough to really address the splendor of your prose, your delightful syntactical surprises, and the rigor really of your scholarship. While reading this book, I thought, to use the last, I hope, painterly simile of the evening, of a trompe-l'oeil, because you look at this book one way and you see these sweeping social historicus vistas, and you look at it the other way and you see these people up close and you even see inside them. How you did it, I have no idea. I want to learn, and maybe you will let us into some of your secrets tonight. But how did you get interested in these people in the first place? How did you stumble upon them? Who are they? And why did they speak to you?
Thank you very much. That's a glorious introduction. I'm embarrassed. Also, just quickly, thanks to Salvatore and Drew Whiteman and Paul Delaverdac from the Cullman Center for setting this up, and to you, Hernan, for agreeing to talk with me. I should say that Hernan and I have talked on this stage once before, not in this room, but at the Cullman Center when his book Trust came out, which I cannot recommend highly enough. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it right now, but I interviewed him in 2022 about that, and it's posted on the Cullman Center website if you want to go learn more about Trust. Okay. I first learned about the Wertheimer paintings that Sargent had done in 2001. I was doing some work in Seattle for the Gates Foundation, actually, as Salvatore mentioned, and there was an exhibition of Sargent at the Seattle Art Museum, and I knew Sargent's work a bit because he makes appearances in my book about Alice James and in my book about Morgan, and I just had liked him at the Metropolitan Museum and in Boston. But so I went to the show and had no idea what it was going to be about, and it was about 12 paintings he did of one family, 12 portraits. The father was an art dealer in London, a very successful art dealer named Asher Wertheimer, and they had become very good friends, it was clear from this exhibition. First, Asher had commissioned Sargent to paint himself and his wife for their 25th wedding anniversary in 1897, and they became friends through that, and then Sargent went on, and Asher commissioned him to do all 10 of their children, singly and in small groups. And the exhibition had photographs of the people as well as the 12 paintings, and one of the photographs showed Asher and Sargent and another, one of Asher's sons, on the lawn of the Wertheimer country house, pausing during a game of croquet. So it looked like they were not just professional friends. And one of the labels said that Sargent was such a frequent guest at the Wertheimers' house in London that the dining room, which showed 8 of the portraits eventually, the dining room came to be known as Sargent's mess. Sargent loved good food, and the Wertheimers had good cooks, so he was indeed there a lot. So I was very intrigued, but I was not looking to write a new book. My book about Morgan had just come out in 1999, so I bought the catalog, and I went back to New York and took a very demanding full-time job right here at the Cullman Center. And I had a million questions about these people, about how did Sargent know the Wertheimers. I thought of him as painting European aristocrats and American elites, but not Jews. And did he have other Jewish friends and sitters? And what was their friendship like? He was an American expatriate, so in one sense an outsider. It turned out that Asher Wertheimer's father, Samson, had come from Bavaria to London in 1839. He was a bronze maker and had become a very successful art dealer. And then both Asher and his brother Charles also continued in that field. And they were, as I say, very successful. They were selling to Rothschilds. I didn't know all this then. I just knew that I was curious. And the experts on the people who had done this show that I saw, I wrote to them and I said, do you think there's more information? Is there a book about these people? And they said, no, we scoured England and the family isn't interested and there's no more information. So I went back to my regular job, and then I tried some more, and I wrote to the Sargent experts who thought, they were great actually, they thought it would be a very interesting subject, but that there was no archive of Wertheimer papers and that it would be hard to write about them. So I gave up again. One day I was looking at a Sargent website online, and someone had written in to ask a question about one of the Wertheimer portraits, and someone else had answered saying, I'm a descendant of Asher Wertheimer, and I don't know very much about that painting, but I can tell you a little bit, and I'd be happy to answer questions. And he gave his email address. So, what would we do without the internet?
So wait, so you wrote him cold?
I wrote to him cold and said who I was and that I was curious about this. He wrote back at some length. I called him. We had a very long talk. I went to England and met him, and he had 3 extremely fat folders full of documents that he let me take and copy. And he introduced me to many of his relatives, one of whom was 90 years old at the time. She was an American, the widow of Asher Wertheimer's youngest grandson. And she knew a lot, and she remembered a lot. And I had photographs of people. She could identify everyone in these photographs.
No way.
She had stories that I had never heard, and she too had a lot of written material. They were in plastic bins in her study. And and then there were more relatives, and so I began to think it was really I could probably get a book out of this.
So we're slowly zooming into John Singer Sargent and the Wertheimer family, and perhaps a good way to do so, since you brought up the issue of archival work and research, it seems to me that, well, it's quite obvious actually that this book has this two-pronged approach on the one hand, anchored in material culture and objects, the paintings themselves, of course, and on the other hand, the archival work with documents. I remember shortly after COVID. When we were having tea at your house, and you handed me some letters that I handed with tremulous hands. Maybe you can include those letters in your answer.
Sure. I did go ahead, and I was talking to a lot of the Wertheimer descendants, none of whom were named Wertheimer, by the way. There were 4 sons, none of whom had children. So all of the descendants were from the daughters and named other things. But one of the daughters had somebody, doesn't matter who, had a packet of letters from Sargent, mainly to let's put up the taller girl in that painting, Ina, who was Sargent's favorite. She's my favorite. She was 6 feet tall. We'll get to her in a little bit. So there were a packet of letters, mostly to her and to some to the other Wertheimers, and one of the descendants had sold them through Sotheby's. So I wrote to Sotheby's and I said, could you put me in touch with the person who bought them? And they did. And it was an American art dealer in Maine and South Carolina, I think. And I wrote to him and said what I was doing and could I see those letters. He said, would photocopies be okay, or do you need to see the originals? I said, photocopies would be fine. And so he said, would you transcribe them for me? And I said, sure. And I realized that Sargent's handwriting is absolutely impossible. Henry James's handwriting is pretty bad. Sargent's is worse. And I had learned, I mean, slowly, when you are living with these documents, you learn how to read them, but it was not easy at all. And I realized that this man couldn't read them. So I said, yes, sure, I'll transcribe them. Seemed like a fair trade. So I did, and I sent them back. I kept the Xeroxes, and I sent the transcripts to him. And then I realized he was going to sell them with my transcripts. And I thought, oh, but it was too late. So I waited. I thought I would hear of a sale. Nothing happened. I called another dealer, the leading Sargent dealer in New York, whom I had become friends with. And I said, what's up with this? Has he sold them, or why haven't we heard about it? She said, he's waiting till your book is published. Because really, nobody except me would want these letters without knowing anything about the Wertheimers. So I thought, okay. And then more time went by, and nothing happened. And then I heard via the Sargent experts that there was an auction coming up in Maine. This was about 3 years ago, of some Sargent letters with transcripts. So I went to the website of this auction house in Maine, and it was pretty clear that it was these letters and my transcripts. And I called my dealer friend again, and I said, what's up? I thought he was going to wait until my book came out. I started to say until I died. But the answer was that he had died. And his estate was selling the letters. So I, of course, registered for the auction. They had a floor bid that they listed, and I decided that I wanted to deal with a person on the phone rather than just bidding online. That seemed too impersonal, and I wouldn't have any control at all, although I wouldn't have had much anyway. So I was talking to a person at the auction house, and I opened with the floor bid. Somebody else raised it $500, and I matched that. And the person I was talking to on the phone said she thought that was a mistake, that it was actually someone who meant to bid on something else. And she said, by the way, have you seen these letters? And I said, oh, yes. Those are my transcripts. And there was no further bid. So going, gone to me. And it was an amazing thing. And about 2 or 3 weeks later, I got them in the mail from the auction house. And it was 2 loose-leaf binders. The letters were in glassine envelopes. And all my correspondence with this man was in there. And also his dealings with Sotheby's when he bought them, including the pound-to-dollar ratio when he bought them. So I could see that I had actually paid less than he did.
Nice.
So it was just to say that it was, I had read them. It was not as if I absolutely needed this information, although the Xeroxes weren't very clear, and the letters had been separated from their envelopes, and often you can date. Sargent never dated his correspondence, so having the envelopes really helps you figure out when he wrote things. But to just have in my hands the conversation between these people was just beyond thrilling. And
Aura,
it still is.
Yeah, aura is a very real thing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
This story that you just shared with us, and how the apparent lack of interest in these incredibly valuable documents, I think also speaks volumes to these paintings as well, and their place within history. You have characterized both Sargent and the Wertheimer family up to you start, if I'm not mistaken, in the 17th century or so. Mm-hmm. In both of these strands, there is this interplay between occupying a very central place. In the case of the Wertheimers in the 17th century, their ancestor Samson, right, was known as the Judenkaiser, and had this extremely central and powerful place, while at the same time being in the periphery for all the obvious reasons. And you ascribe a certain similar sense of dissonance between center and periphery with John Singer Sargent himself, with his itinerant upbringing all the way to his sexuality, but also the place of his paintings that were, of course, deeply embedded in a very clear painterly tradition that you trace back to Velázquez mainly, right? Mm-hmm. And were extremely well received at the time, but also deemed by other critics in sort of at the dawn of high modernism as obsolete to some extent. So there is that disconnect within Sargent himself. And I think the way in which you first experienced these paintings kind of embeds the story about the letters, of course, does, but the way in which you first experienced these paintings also represents very graphically and explicitly this kind of tension between center and periphery. Would you like to share with us that passage when you first meet these paintings and set it up for us?
Sure,
yeah.
Thank you. It's actually, I first met them in Seattle in 2001. Right. So we should back up for a minute to say that they had since they were, so Asher left 9 of these 12 paintings to the National Gallery, and it was in his will. So he and his wife would keep them for their lifetimes, and after they had both died, they would go to the National Gallery. So we can come back and talk about that more, because when they were put on display in 1923 after his wife had died, and they were very controversial. They've been controversial all along. Their great portraits give rise to many different interpretations, and these are a very good example. But the fact that the subjects were Jewish was a very big part of the response. Some of it was aesthetic, but a lot of it was just that portraits are the subject of, the subjects of portraits traditionally are royals and popes and so on, and suddenly here are these 8-foot-high portraits of Jews in the middle of the National Gallery. It was very controversial. Mm-hmm. So they went from the National Gallery to the Tate in the 1920s, and then were in storage for most of the 20th century.
Are they still in storage? So they took it in, yeah. Mostly,
but they're coming out more now, yeah. And we'll talk about that a bit. They were in storage. So when I decided I was going to go ahead and I wanted to see them again, I was going to England a lot to talk to all these people and see what I could find. So I asked the Tate if I could go visit the paintings in storage, which I got permission to do. So it's a facility in the East End, and I had an appointment, and I went by underground bus and on foot. It was a heavily guarded compound. I had to go through checkpoints and a series of locked doors, and I arrived there in time for my appointment. And I'm just going to read you a paragraph about this. 10 is the maximum number of pictures one is allowed to request, and I had asked for 10. Actually, I said he gave 9. There was a 10th that was given later on. So of the Wertheimer paintings, 10 are at the Tate. 1 is in New Orleans, and 1 is in Washington, D.C. The woman assigned to help me, whose name was Sarah, was 8 months pregnant. This was her last day of work before maternity leave. The paintings are stored vertically in huge racks that pull out of their units on fixed tracks. The first one I looked at, of Flora, Asher Wertheimer's wife, had been taken out and propped against a wall. But most of the others remained in their racks, which meant I had to bend my head to the side or climb a scaffolding ladder to study them. It was thrilling to see the paintings again, now that I was planning to write about them. And I describe what I saw. I don't think we need to do that whole thing, but
no.
After... I was looking at them differently now that I was planning to write about them than I had when I first saw them in Seattle. But after examining the paintings for 3 hours, I asked Sarah how much time had been allotted for my visit. 30 minutes, she said.
I have several things to say, but you just said something sort of offhandedly. I was looking at the pictures differently now that I was planning to write about them. What was that shift? Can you talk about that shift in your gaze?
I don't know if I can break it down, but it was obviously I had the first time it was just curiosity and intrigue. But now I sort of felt like I was going to have to inhabit these paintings in a way. And I mean, I'm not an expert writer about art, so I was going to have to figure out how to talk about them in terms of what they were doing as art, but also what they were doing as showing us these people. Should we flip through? I mean,
I would love that.
We don't have to do all of them now, but I just thought we should show a few more.
We must.
Yeah.
Yes.
So this fellow is actually the ancestor in 17th century Vienna, also named Samson Wertheimer, who was court factor, which is also called court Jew, meaning financier, to 3 Holy Roman emperors. He was the wealthiest Jew in Europe at the time. He was called Judenkaiser, as Hernan said. And he was also the chief rabbi of most of the Holy Roman Emperor, and a Talmudic scholar and a protector of Jews all over the Habsburg land. So he was an awesome dude.
Awesome also is because money is such an integral part of your narrative, and needless to say, I'm interested in the ways in which we talk about money. If we go back to Samson, this was a time
to this Samson or Asher?
To this one. This was a time when, and I quote you, there were as yet no formal banks or standardized state-issued currencies, which blew my mind because it's so recent, you know, and to think of the trajectory from there to our Asher is well, perhaps you will address that as we slide through. From
there to Morgan to Trust.
Exactly. Yes. In such a short period of time.
Well, I'm not going to go into the whole financial history from then, but their rulers needed people who could raise money quickly, and without banks and treasury departments, they needed people who had access to funds. And it wasn't always Jews. The Medici certainly were bankers and had access to a great deal of wealth, but often it was Jews, for some of the same reasons that Jews became art dealers. There were networks, they could speak languages in common. That's been rather oversimplified, but this Samson, he was financing wars and treaties and marriage settlements. So yeah, they were needed and protected by the Kaisers until something went wrong. And then if you made a mistake, you were out or dead.
Yes. To go back to our Asher, would you like to talk about this painting and how it was received and the controversies around it?
Sure. I mean, it's the most controversial of the Wertheimer paintings, and he looks they all look Jewish, but he really does. And many of the Wertheimer's friends were offended. I mean, his red, fleshy lips, his grin, his look could be read as calculating and sly, or as warm and engaged. He and Sargent were, by this time, becoming very good friends. He was an expert in the history of art. There's a lot of reference in this painting to Velázquez and Franz Hals, who were Sargent's heroes in many ways, and Asher knew a great deal about them. He's holding a cigar in his left hand, and his right hand is his thumb is hooked into his pocket. To his right, below him, is his poodle, a standard poodle named Noble, black with his tongue lolling out. So the tongue could also stand for the carnal appetites that are standard tropes of anti-Semitism. So obviously, Asher was not offended by this painting. I think, but as I said, great portraits give rise to any number of interpretations, and I'll get back to what I think in a minute. But when another sitter for Sargent, Ian Phelps Stokes, who was an architect, and he and his wife were posing in the studio at the same time Sargent was working on Asher. He looked at this and he said, he seems to be pleasantly engaged in counting golden shekels. And when the paintings were first shown at the National Gallery in 1923, after Asher had died, there was a debate about them in a committee in Parliament. And one of the members of Parliament, who was the member from Oxford and actually a history professor at Oxford, asked the chairman of the committee, can't you manage it so that we don't have to have these repulsive pictures on our walls for all time next to the beautiful examples of the work of Turner? So there was that. But on the other side, many people compared this to Rembrandt said, lucky is the man whose portrait has been painted thus. I mean, it really is a huge cultural divide, the way people respond to these paintings. I think Asher and Sargent were having a very good time here, as Sargent was with some of the others, some of the daughters, which we'll see. And they knew what they were doing. I mean, Sargent certainly knew what he was doing. He's definitely painting a Jewish man. He was very interested in Jews. He was friends with many Jews and painted many of them. He was interested in visual drama. A big Jewish family was an exciting, dynamic subject in a time of dramatic social change. And Asher left these paintings to the nation. He was a very wealthy man. He wanted his family on the walls next to the examples of the work of Gainsborough and Lawrence and Reynolds. And I think he was extremely comfortable with his Jewish identity. He says, as if he were saying about this portrait, this is who I am.
Yeah, it does come across. Mm-hmm. I'm also taken by the extreme contrast in color in this painting. Oh, and if we can look perhaps at his wife's Flora's to paint, there are two versions, correct, of her paintings.
Yes.
You describe and I love this book so much, and my favorite moments are when Jean describes the paintings. In the first portrait of Flora, the one we're looking at right now, and I quote, "The pearls on Flora's choker look like single taps of Sargent's brush. The color of a small jade dragon on a table beside her echoes her pallor." What?
That's of this one, the next one.
Oh, I mixed them up. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. It's two different paintings, but that's fine.
Yes. The second one is he portrays her in black, seated in near darkness, with graying hair and quieter jewels. Majestic, grave, apart. There are your taps of the brush. Majestic, grave, apart. It's so great.
Thank you.
Would you like to tell us how these were received by the sitter and the story behind them?
Sure. Thanks. So the first one was done at the same time as the painting of Asher. It was their anniversary celebration. And it's a beautiful painting. She was obviously dressed in a lot of jewelry, lace, silk. Sargent very much curated what his subjects wore. People showed up in something and he would say, that's not right. Yeah. And there was a wonderful show in Boston a couple of years ago, and then at the Tate called Sargent and Fashion that talked about this a lot. He sometimes had people bring several outfits and decided how he wanted them to dress. So we don't know whether this was her idea or his idea, but it's a beautiful picture, and she was a beautiful woman. She was the daughter of an art dealer, and actually her whole family were art dealers. So it was another dynasty, sort of like the Wertheimers, of very successful Jewish art dealers and knowledgeable. She didn't like this painting, and I think Asher probably didn't either. And some of the descendants said that she thought it made her look too rich. If she didn't choose to wear the jewels and the lace, she agreed to Sargent's asking her to do that. And so This actually reflects back a little bit to the painting of Asher, because they rejected this one. I mean, they kept it, but they didn't. They had him do. Sargent painted another one of her 6 years later, which was somewhat unusual. But if Asher hadn't liked his portrait, he would have rejected it as well. They didn't reject that. They rejected this one, and he eventually went to one of her daughters, and long after that was sold to the New Orleans Museum of Art. So it's there. I've seen it there a couple of times. It's worth a visit. But 6 years later, in 1904, Sargent painted Mrs. Wertheimer again. By this time, both their oldest sons had died in their 20s, which is double tragedies. And I think you see that in her face here. She wore black for the rest of her life, and it was 2 years. This was 2 years after they had died, but that's pretty recent, and it's a majestic portrait. They liked this one and kept it. And Asher, he hung them all in the dining room at his house on Connaught Place, which is just above Marble Arch. And his was at one end, and this was at the other end.
Since you brought up the death of the children, could we talk about Alfred for a moment? He's dear. He's so endearing and heartbreaking to me.
Yes, this is the second son. The first son is Edward, who also died, and his life was unfinished, and this painting is unfinished. But this painting was finished. He was very beautiful, as you see, and he was a chemist, so the glass retorts on the wall behind him signify his work. All of the sons went to Harrow and then to Oxford or Cambridge, which was what you did in the arc of upward mobility of a wealthy Jewish family in England. Alfred didn't finish at Cambridge and went to work for a chemistry lab outside of London, but he really wanted to be an actor, and his father wouldn't hear of it. Just not an acceptable profession in their world. And they fought bitterly, and Sargent tried to mediate between them. There were a couple of wonderful letters from Sargent to Alfred saying...
Yes, those are fantastic, yes.
Yeah. Saying, meet me... Sargent was teaching at the Royal Academy by this time. He said, meet me after my classes. I'm going to this place for lunch, and I just want to talk to you about your quarrel with your father. He thinks he's very much in earnest. He means to cut you off without any inheritance, and I would hate to see you have a life of suffering. And and then there's a second letter like that from Sargent to Alfred, saying that there's a new quarrel with your father, and I understand you've lent some money to someone and it's gone. Why don't you let me be the person you lent the money to, and I will pay it back to you tomorrow, and it will be done. And we don't have to discuss the question of you're going on the stage. So I don't know what happened about that. That's one of the frustrating things about these little fragments of letters without much context. But when this painting was shown in the National Gallery in 1902, it was a huge success. And Alfred was he was recognized walking down the street in London. And one critic said something about the beautiful portrait of the Jewish youth. And he said, not that he was beautiful, and actually, he was beautiful, But he went to he had a friend who had business in South Africa, and he'd been there a few months before this painting was done. And then after that, he went back to South Africa and died. And some people thought he was in the Boer War. It was 1902, but he wasn't. And I managed to find out through years of digging that he died in his hotel room in Johannesburg. And he was a chemist, as I said, and he died of an overdose of morphine, and his heart stopped. And it was ultimately ruled a suicide. So I don't know how you go on from that as a parent. And then his brother, wrong way, was going to take over the firm. He was the one person in the family who was going to work with Asher in the art dealing business. And he got married in the end of 1902, went to Paris on his honeymoon, ate a bad oyster, and died of typhoid. So.
Okay.
I don't know if that deserves a laugh, but
No. But I want to make sure, since we're talking about the children and to have a more uplifting moment as well,
Yes.
we absolutely must talk. You know where I'm going.
I do.
You do. We need to talk about Ina. Yes. Here she is with her sister Betty. Is that right? Yes. And then we will also talk about a second painting of hers. In my obsessive preparation toward this talk, I watch you talk about that fan, and now I can't see it in any other way. Can you share the fan, please?
I can. It's an amazing. Sargent is really showing off with that fan. It's sure she's holding it like this, as you can see. It's like with the downstroke, and it makes her arm look 8 feet long. It's foreshortened. It's a hard thing to do, and he's showing off, as I say, that he can do that, make the arm look realistic, make the fingers work, make the hand look realistic. And people said, there's no way that arm is a human proportion. And a medical student in London at the time who read all these criticisms actually did an anatomy study and looked at 20 different people's arms and said, that's fine. The proportion is just right. Can I read that little section about the
Please do.
Sargent in his studio in London? So while he was working on this, someone else came to visit the studio. What do you think of it? Sargent asked an American visitor to his studio in 1901, indicating his portrait in progress of the two eldest Wertheimer daughters. His questions made his own answer clear. Isn't it stunning of the taller girl? Don't you think she's handsome? A few minutes later, isn't Miss Wertheimer beautiful? 6 feet tall, with luxuriant dark hair and a voluptuous figure, she was 23 when Sargent, 41, entered the Wertheimer family circle. They remained such close friends that her husband later wondered whether they had been lovers.
Yes.
Which was a little clueless of her husband, but
It seems so. Yes. And there is a second
yes.
there's a second
We'll
portrait solo
go
or
forward to
sola
that.
of Ina, and who will also
Sorry.
play an important part in the afterlife of the House of Wertheimer in connection to the arts.
yes. So this is Ina just a couple of years after the one with her sister. She came into his studio for a sitting, not wearing this, but she was in a rush. She was always late. She was just a larger-than-life personality, and her cloak and her scarf and her hair were all blowing out behind her, billowing out, and he thought he wanted to paint her just like that, in full sail. And he called the painting A Vela Gonfie, which means in full sail in Italian. He was fluent in Italian. We haven't talked too much about Sargent's life, but I think we're running out of time. He grew up all over Europe, fluent in Italian and French, and very comfortable in all the countries of Europe and the US. And so Ina, he decided to paint her in full sail, and at the time he was painting this, he was also painting the Marlborough family. The Duke of Marlborough was married to an American, Consuelo Vanderbilt. The Marlboroughs were running out of money. Consuelo Vanderbilt had plenty of that, but it was a terrible marriage, and it ended not long after Sargent did his portrait of them. But he painted them in their grand house at Blenheim to go opposite a Reynolds portrait of an earlier Duke of Marlborough and his family. So he's painting them, but sometimes the Duke comes into London to sit for just his own part of the portrait, and he wears his garter robes. The most royal order of the Garter is this deep blue velvet cloak and the hat with ostrich feathers. And he left his cloak and hat in the studio between sittings. It's the highest honor in England, the Royal Order, the Order of the Garter. Only 25 people have it at a time, in addition to the royal family. The King Edward VII appointed his wife a Lady of the Garter. That was the first time. So here's the Duke of Marlborough coming in his very grand aristocratic clothing, and here's Ina Wertheimer, Jewish, beautiful, full of life. I'm going to take a sidestep for a minute and say that when a portrait of Lady Sassoon, who was born Aline Rothschild, Sargent painted her in 1907, and that exhibition that was shown at the Royal Academy, and someone seeing it said to his friend, "Sargent paints nothing but Jews and Jewesses now. He says they have so much more life, and he prefers them. He says they have so much more life and movement than our English women." I think you see that in this painting. You see it in the double portrait of Ina and Betty. So here's Ina, and he dresses her up in if it's not literally the Duke's cloak, because I don't know how the Duke would have felt about that, it's a good facsimile. And so she's having been in deep décolletage in the earlier painting. She's now completely clothed in masculine black, but her face is radiantly beautiful. And they were, I think, playing with the sort of androgyny, the double ways you could see this. There was a Punch cartoon of this at the time, of her as like this, as a dashing cavalier saying, "Call yourself a soldier, look at me." So it was a very playful friendship, and she, as I say, was clearly his favorite. And this is a smashing portrait, I think.
Those whites, I don't understand how he does it.
I don't either.
Get it.
I don't either.
Shall we take some questions?
Sure.
Yeah. So here is one. Did any parts of the archival materials seem distorted or fabricated in obvious or subtle ways? Did Sargent, in his letters, present himself in a way that may not have been aligned with his truest self? And then there's a follow-up about the Freudian undertone of your title.
Okay. Wait, I'm just thinking about this. Read it again.
Sure. Did any parts of the archival materials seem distorted or fabricated in obvious or subtle ways? Did Sargent, in his letters, present himself in a way that may not have been aligned with his truest self?
I don't really think so. I'd have to think some more about that, but he's a wonderful, witty writer. Even though his handwriting is impossible to decipher, he's very gifted with words. He was also gifted with music. He started that early on when living in Florence, and could have had a second career as a pianist, and went to hear music and see ballets all the time. He doesn't reveal himself either in his portraits or in his letters. He's very private and
Do you want to
reserved.
show his self-portrait?
Yes.
I think that's pertinent here.
It is indeed. Here, do you want? Oh, well, I've got it. It's okay. We'll get right back to it in a minute. Most artists do scads of self-portraits because the subject is always at hand. You know, you're right there. You look in the mirror. You just don't need a model. You don't need to make an appointment. You just paint that person. Sargent did almost no self-portraits. There are 3 paintings, 1 or 2 drawings, and he looks very closed in all of them. This one was done for the Uffizi Gallery. There's a corridor of famous painters, and it was commissioned by them for him to be part of that corridor, but he's not revealing. Those eyes do not present a window on the soul. It's a perfectly good painting, but it's compared to what he does with other people he paints, you don't see much inside him. Yeah. So he was not at all self-revelatory, either in paint or in language. Yeah. I just want to say he's a couple of little bon mots. I mean, he says to Ina at one point, "Why won't some of my sitters' portraits get finished? I've tried giving my nephews mumps to some of them, but."
Well, I would also add that I've yet to meet the person who doesn't distort themselves subtly to,
Yes.
that objectivity. And that's where the biographer, I suppose, comes into play to try to look through the opacity and the noise, which is part of any life story. Had you had, this is another question from the audience, had you had previous experience in art history? What do you enjoy about art history that you don't experience studying or writing about regular history? Phoebe, she signs it, so Phoebe. Thank you, Phoebe.
Thank you, Phoebe. Morgan was an art collector, so I had written a lot about collecting art, but not about creating art. Which is a completely different thing. And it was a huge education for me. All my books are huge educations, but this one, the art world was just not something I knew well. And people who do know a lot about art are very mean about people who...
Is that true?
About people who don't, yes. And, I mean, I saw this in the Morgan world because dealers or art experts were scathing about this rich guy who's marching in and buying up Raphaels and Rembrandts and couldn't possibly have any taste. And they, the experts, really know stuff. And this guy just has a lot of money. And so they're sneering. And that comes up in this book, too, and to some extent, when the experts, the critics, find Sargent much too pretty, much too fashionable, much too successful, and they hate that. So.
Yeah, that's something I wanted to discuss, but we don't have time. The relationship, the notion of value in your book in particular, by which I mean this two-sided notion of the term aesthetic value on the one hand and financial value on the other hand. And I think that double-sidedness is at play constantly in your book, and the central action takes place at a time when the alignment of these two things is seen as a suspicious thing, right? Aesthetic value ought to go against monetary value.
Yeah.
So I think perhaps Sargent got caught in the
I think
crosshair.
so. Yeah.
Here's a question, unsigned, that allows us to go back to Ina. Why is Ina your favorite? You talked a little bit about that. Why was he Sargent's favorite? You also talked a little bit about that. But what you did not talk about was what she did later on in relation to the art market. Would you like to share that?
Yes. So because Edward, the eldest son, died at his 20s, there was no Wertheimer to carry the firm forward. And so when Asher died, and his brother Charles died, who had sons who also did not go on in the business, that was the end of the firm altogether. And their name isn't nearly as well known as other firms from the time that did continue into the 20th century. So there was no male Wertheimer to continue that tradition or that business. But there was Ina, who married another wealthy German Jewish man, actually from Cologne, but living in London, and had a substantial inheritance from her father. And she opened an art gallery opposite Claridge's in London and called it the Claridge Gallery. And it opened in 1925, shortly after Sargent died, and her first show was of Sargent watercolors that he had given to various members of the Wertheimer family, and then other paintings by Sargent that were loaned from other of his friends. But then, unlike her father and grandfather, who had been dealing in old master paintings and 18th century French decorative arts, she represented modern artists. So the parade of early 20th century artists marched through her gallery doors, and it was quite a successful. I mean, I don't know that she made much money, but she did have extraordinary shows, and she was also very close to Diaghilev, the director of the Ballet Russe, and showed, excuse me, a lot of the work that was done for those ballets, the set designs, the costumes, and using the art, having the art done by the artists who were commissioned by Diaghilev.
Didn't you also? I remember you telling me at some point, and forgive me if I'm misquoting you, but didn't you hypothesize of figures of sort of high modernism in painting, like Picasso, being surrounded by these Sargents at some point? Am I getting this wrong?
No, you're right.
Yeah.
So one night in 1917, Diaghilev was in London, and he brought Picasso to London to do the set designs for one of his ballets. And of course, artistic London lionized the great man. They were just thrilled. And one night, Adelaine Morel, who was a very good friend of Ina's, brought him to the Wertheimer house for dinner. Unfortunately, nobody wrote down what happened. But Picasso's biographer, John Richardson, wondered in his life of Picasso what Picasso would have made sitting in that dining room surrounded by 8 Sargent portraits. And would he have been surprised? And I can't quite remember. I mean, I think actually Picasso himself did portraits, quite spectacular ones in many ways. There are 2 little things about this. He did a fantastic portrait of Gertrude Stein, and friends of hers, when they saw it, said it didn't really look like her. And Picasso said, accurately, it will. But also, Sargent was very close to Monet. That's a whole other story. He brought Monet to the Wertheimer house for dinner, too. But another artist friend of his, recalled a day when Monet and this friend went to Sargent's studio for lunch and they were looking at everything that was there. And the friend later said to Sargent, well, he didn't say anything about these Wertheimer portraits, which were on the walls of the studio because he was working on them then. And Sargent said, but he hates this kind of painting. So, I mean, you might have said that about Picasso, but I don't think so.
Right, but going back to portraiture, in your book, there is a clear. One gets a sense of Sargent feeling claustrophobic, and feeling imprisoned within this kind of niche into which, forgive me, he painted himself.
Yes,
it just came out.
Indeed.
Right, and that he was, and he comes up with these charming wordplays. The way he spells portraits with P-A-U-H-G-H-T. It's very funny. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about his confinement in this world of portraiture and what and was there a way out?
He made a way out. So the Wertheimer paintings were done between 1898 and 1908, which was sort of the peak of his success and popularity. He mock complained to a friend while he was doing this of being in a state of chronic Wertheimerism. But everybody on both sides of the Atlantic wanted to be painted by Sargent, and he'd been very successful. He didn't need to keep earning a lot of money. And some of his paintings went quickly, but some of them required 17, 20 sittings. And he loved getting out of the studio, getting out of cities. He traveled constantly all his life. He loved going to Morocco, to all over Italy, to the Alps, and to paint. He always painted. He worked his entire life. Even on vacations, he would take paints and costumes to dress his friends in so that they could pose for him. And in 1907, as he was coming to the end of the Wertheimer Commission and many others, he wrote to a friend, "No more portraits, Paughtrais. I abhor and abjure them and hope never to do another, especially of the upper classes." So the critics who went after him for just being a successful society painter never stopped beating him up about that. But he lived for another 20 years. He died in 1925, and he stopped painting portraits in 1907. What he did instead was travel, painting landscapes, watercolors. The demand for portraits didn't let up, so he started doing charcoal sketches, which he could do in 2 or 3 hours as opposed to 17 sittings. And he was actually extremely good at that. And there was a show at the Morgan Library a few years ago of his charcoal portraits, which were just great. One of the best is of Sybil Sassoon, who was another very close friend of his. So he got out from under the demand of portrait painting, but he never stopped painting other things. That's just what he did.
Right. I'm afraid I'm getting signals from the back of the room. I could talk forever about this wonderful book. Please, I implore you, read it. You will get lost in it in the most delightful way. Jean Strouse, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you to you.
Outside.